Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Heiko, who is a beginning photographer from Germany. Heiko shot this with a Canon 350D, an 18 to 50 zoom, and an effective focal length of 28 millimeters. And in the backstory, Heiko tells us that this is an art installation in the Negev Desert in Israel. He said that this person who is in the background that looks like they're facing away was actually facing the camera. He's edited the image to make it look like they were facing away. He said he did that because after he started to look at the image bigger, he started to get a sense of a story where someone has walked to the end of the path. They can't go left or right. They're kind of faced with this choice of moving into this void. And Heiko also edited the image to leave a little bit of color along the edge of the path, so most of the image has been desaturated. Really enjoy the story aspect of the image. It's definitely a surreal setting. I mean, you could almost imagine that this whole image is a composite, and it's a stage of sorts, and whenever we put a human figure into a situation like this, it definitely dramatically increases the chance that people will start to make up a story. And I think the idea of facing the person away and having the person so small and out in the distance in just a silhouette makes it a lot easier for each individual viewer to imagine themselves being in the situation, or to make up a story that's more universal. So one of the first takeaways from the critique today is so much of the time as storytellers, actually leaving room for mystery, not showing the viewer everything, can increase the chances that we'll communicate in a more powerful way. The other thing that's interesting to me about the image is just thinking about the concept of formal symmetry versus dynamic symmetry. There's a real strong sense of some aspect of a formally symmetrical composition with a path going almost right down the middle. These two rocks at the end creating a feeling of formal symmetry in this moment with the one cloud centered over the figure in the end of the path, and then again just balance in the sky with a feeling of clouds on either side of the main cloud, so on and so forth. The negative spaces over here are about the same size, but then there's also a subtle sense of some dynamic movement from left to right where it's not exactly formally symmetrical, and you do get a sense of some balance moving back, particularly on diagonals. I think a really important part of the composition, if we're thinking about balance, is this dark area right here, because on a diagonal it sort of pushes back against the weight, or kind of pulls against the weight of the person leaning to this side. To me, these two ideas on a diagonal are pretty visually important if we're thinking about trying to continue to balance this image kind of along the middle because of this starting point, this formally symmetrical. And one of the things that I try and think about in my own work when I'm trying to create visual unity for the viewer is the idea, the simple ideas of formal symmetry versus dynamic symmetry, and also just looking at basic balance, what's happening along the top and bottom of the frame, and how do these balance each other, what happens from left to right, and what happens on the major diagonals. Another interesting thing to think about here in terms of balance is how Heiko has cut the bottom of the picture in camera. Up here, you've got a feeling of some of the clouds being cut off and kind of a rough edge negative space shape up there, and in sort of reverse, Heiko's done that at the bottom. Instead of cutting this in the middle of this stone where you have a very smooth base for most of the image, Heiko's let a little bit of this shape come in. So you have a negative space shape here, positive space shape, negative space shape, and positive space shape with these sort of stones right here. This is all kind of broken up, similar to the way that it's broken up along the top. And again, I think kind of having those concepts from top to bottom balanced fairly equally goes along with the feeling of this formal symmetry, or close to formal symmetry, of the pathway itself and where it's been placed in the image. So a couple of things, just thinking about less might be more in terms of storytelling and the power of mystery, and just different ways that we can consider balance, particularly in a situation where we have time to contemplate these kinds of things in a camera. One of the main things that I think about in any picture is sort of what is my main subject and how can I make it come forward more, and how can I simplify for the viewer. And in this case, desaturating and leaving just a little bit of color anytime that we essentially isolate subject, and it's different than everything else in the frame, it takes on a lot of visual weight. And for me, this little bit of color along the edge of the path really competes with the main subject in the picture, which is to me the person that's facing away. And so one of the things that I would do to this image almost immediately if I was editing it is just go ahead and convert it all the way to black and white. For me now, when I do get to the figure in the image, instead of then going back to the color and having the color competing with that idea, once I find the person in the image, that really becomes a very, very strong, powerful visual anchor. And so another thing that I'd really encourage you to think about, just in terms of how the critique today might help you with your own photography, is that asking yourself the question about what is your main idea and what is your main subject, and then understanding that we might have an idea that doesn't show up much at all in our image, but if it's very different than everything else, then so much of the time, whether we want it to or not, it will take on an enormous amount of visual weight. The other thing that happens in terms of color versus monochrome is that once we start to introduce a little bit of color, the very high values like white or things that are near white start to take on more and more visual weight, because white is the absence of color. So any color at all will start to give white a lot more power. And the other thing that happens for me, and having just a little bit of color in the rocks, is the cloud at the top part of the image starts to pull away from the main figure. And when those rocks that are sort of brown start to move more towards the black and white and have more contrast in them, the image also feels more balanced from top to bottom. I feel more of a unity with the edge of the cloud and this shape and here. The whole image, it just really changes the way that I look at the whole image. From here, I think you could definitely come in and play around with curves and maybe play around with layers if you wanted to pop the contrast even more in here, maybe do it in a subtle way to bring the main figure forward more. You could look at the potential of playing around with contrast or local value changes to create even more of a feeling of movement to the main subject. But I like it quite a bit just the way that it is, just converting to black and white. I'd love to hear your feedback about the critique today. It's a really powerful image. I want to say a big thank you to Heiko for sharing his image with us on the Mindful Eye's Daily Critique. Hope to see you again real soon on the Mindful Eye. Thanks a lot, everybody.